Hello and welcome. I am so glad you are here, joining me for tonight's story on the Sleep Tales channel. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let go of your day. Allow your body to feel heavy and relaxed. Tonight's story is a quiet one, a story about loss and light and the slow, steady process of growth. Before we begin, if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps so much. You can also drop a like on this video and leave a comment to let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It is always a comfort to know where these stories travel. Now, close your eyes, breathe in and breathe out. Let the story begin. Willow was a quiet person. She lived a quiet life. At 23 years old, she had found a rhythm that suited her. It was a rhythm set to the silent hours of the night, a time when the rest of the city was asleep. Willow worked at the city flower market. It was not a small shop with a pretty bell on the door. It was a huge building, a warehouse made of concrete and steel, a place the size of an airplane hangar. It was the heart of the city's flower trade, a place that was awake and alive while the streets outside were dark and empty. She worked the night shift, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. She liked the night. The dark was like a soft blanket over the world, and in the market, under the steady hum of the long fluorescent lights, she could be herself. She did not have to make small talk. She did not have to smile when she did not feel like it. She could simply work, surrounded by the cool air and the earthy smell of living things. Her job was to prepare the flowers. They arrived in long cardboard boxes, packed tightly, sleeping from their long journeys from farms all around the world. Willow's job was to wake them up. She would cut open the boxes and carefully lift out the heavy bunches of roses, lilies, tulips, and daisies. She would snip their stems at an angle just so and peel away any bruised leaves or petals. Then she would place them into big plastic buckets of fresh, cold water. She loved this part. She loved the feeling of the cool stems in her hands and the crisp sound the cutters made. She loved watching the flowers drink the water, their tired heads slowly lifting, their petals seeming to breathe in the cool air of the warehouse. Willow had a small, secret ritual, a private game she played with the city. At the end of her shift, just as the sun was beginning to touch the tops of the tallest buildings, she would gather the leftover flowers. These were the flowers that were not perfect enough to be sold to the fancy shops. A rose with a slightly bent stem, a lily with a small brown spot on one petal, a carnation that had opened a little too wide. To anyone else, they were flaws. To Willow, they were special. They had character. She would take a few of these flowers and, with great care, arrange them into a small, perfect bouquet. She would tie it with a piece of simple string. Then, on her way home, she would leave it somewhere for a stranger to find. Sometimes she would leave it on an empty bus seat. Sometimes she would place it on a park bench next to a sleeping old man. Sometimes she would tuck it into the basket of a bicycle chained to a lamppost. She never stayed to watch someone find it. The joy was in the act of giving, a quiet, anonymous gift of beauty to a sleeping city. It was her small way of sending a message, a soft whisper that said, even in a big, busy world, there is still room for something gentle. It was her way of connecting with people she would never meet. The most important person in Willow's world was her brother, Leo. He was 3 years older than her, and he was her everything. Where Willow was quiet, Leo was loud. Where Willow was still, Leo was always moving. He was a soldier, stationed in a country far away, a place with huge mountains and a sky so big it seemed to have no end. He was her hero, her protector, and her best friend. Their connection lived in the words they sent back and forth across the world. Leo would write her long emails filled with descriptions of his life. He wrote about the taste of the bread they ate, the sound of the wind in the high mountain passes, the colors of the sunset behind the jagged peaks. He had a way with words that made her feel like she was standing right there next to him. She could almost feel the dry desert air and smell the dust. His emails were her window to a world she had never seen, a world of adventure and wide open spaces. In return, she would tell him about her quiet life. She told him about the flowers, about the different shades of red in a batch of new roses, about the powerful scent of a box of freshly cut lilies. She told him about her secret bouquets and where she left them. He loved that. He told her she was spreading magic in the world. He was her biggest supporter, the one person who understood her quiet heart. He was the anchor in her life, the steady presence that made her feel safe, even from thousands of miles away. Chapter 1: The Sound of Silence. The night began like any other. The air outside was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of rain that had fallen earlier in the evening. Willow walked her usual path to the market, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound on the wet pavement. Streetlights cast long, yellow pools of light on the empty sidewalks. Inside the massive warehouse, the familiar world greeted her. The air was chilled to keep the flowers fresh, and it felt clean and green in her lungs. The steady hum of the giant refrigeration units was a constant, comforting sound, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. She waved a quiet hello to Marcus, the night manager, who sat in his small glass office watching over the vast floor. She went to her workstation, a long metal table that was wet with water and littered with stray green leaves from the day shift. She tied on her waterproof apron and pulled on her thin work gloves. The first task was always the same. A new shipment of roses had arrived from South America. Willow used a sharp knife to slice open the top of a long cardboard box. Inside, nestled in green paper, were dozens and dozens of roses. They were a deep, velvety red, the color of a dark secret. They were still tightly closed, their petals wrapped around each other like a fist. She worked methodically, her hands moving with a practiced grace. She lifted a heavy bunch of roses from the box. She carried them to the deep sink and ran cold water over them, washing away the dust of their long journey. Then, one by one, she prepared them. She held each rose, feeling the surprising strength of its woody stem. She pulled off the lower leaves, the ones that would sit below the waterline and rot. She was careful of the thorns. She had learned long ago not to rush this part. The thorns were sharp and unforgiving. With her cutters, she made a clean, sharp snip at the bottom of each stem. The sound was crisp and satisfying in the quiet warehouse. Finally, she placed the prepared roses into a large black bucket filled with clean, cold water. As she worked, her mind was far away. She was thinking about Leo. He had sent her an email that morning. It was short, but it was full of his usual energy. He had described a hike he had taken up into the hills. He wrote about a small, tough flower he had seen growing out of a crack in a rock. He said it reminded him of her because it was beautiful and strong in a quiet, unexpected place. The thought made her smile. She was already composing her reply in her head. She would tell him about these roses, how their color was so deep it was almost black in the dim light. She would tell him that one of the delivery drivers had brought in a box of donuts and she had eaten one with pink frosting. She would tell him about the little things, because those were the things he loved to hear about. Those were the things that made him feel connected to home. The hours passed in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The pile of empty cardboard boxes grew. The buckets filled up with flowers, all standing tall and straight, drinking in the water. She moved from the roses to a box of white lilies. Their smell was powerful, a sweet and heavy perfume that filled the air around her. She handled them gently. Their petals were like soft wax and could bruise easily. As she worked, she thought about a bouquet she could make at the end of her shift. Perhaps a single white lily paired with a sprig of delicate baby's breath. It would be an elegant, simple gift for a stranger to find. It would be a little piece of peace in the middle of a busy city morning. The night wore on. Forklifts moved silently in the distance, their red lights blinking. Other night workers moved through the aisles, their voices low and soft. There was a sense of shared purpose in the quiet, a feeling of being part of a secret world that came alive only after the sun went down. Willow felt a sense of belonging here that she rarely felt in the bright, loud world of the daytime. Here, among the sleeping flowers and the quiet work, she could just be. The end of her shift came with the first hint of gray light in the high windows of the warehouse. The world outside was beginning to stir. She cleaned her station, wiping down the metal table and sweeping the floor of fallen leaves and stems. She chose her flowers for her morning ritual. A few pale pink carnations that were a little too open, and a stem of fern that was slightly bent. She wrapped them in a small piece of brown paper and tied them with string. She said her quiet goodbyes and stepped out of the chilled air of the market into the dawn. The air was fresh and cool. The city was still mostly quiet, but the first signs of life were beginning to appear. A lone bus rumbled down the street. A man was unlocking the metal grate of his small coffee shop. Willow enjoyed this time of day. It felt like she had a secret. She knew that in a few hours, these streets would be filled with people and noise. But for now, it was hers. She walked towards her apartment, a small place on the third floor of an old brick building. She decided to leave her bouquet on the steps of the public library, a grand old building with stone lions out front. She imagined a student arriving early to study, finding the flowers and smiling. The thought warmed her. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, her legs tired from a long night of standing. She pulled her keys from her pocket, looking forward to a warm cup of tea and her comfortable bed. That was when she saw them. Two men. They were standing in front of her apartment door. They were not police officers. They were soldiers, dressed in formal military uniforms. Their clothes were perfectly pressed, and their shoes were shined to a mirror finish. They stood unnaturally still, their faces serious and empty. For a moment, Willow's mind could not understand what she was seeing. It was like a picture from a movie, something that did not belong in the ordinary hallway of her ordinary building. One of the men, who was older with gray hair at his temples, took a small step forward. He spoke her name, but it sounded strange, too formal. He asked if she was Willow. She nodded, her throat suddenly tight and dry. The bouquet of flowers in her hand suddenly felt heavy and foolish. The man's eyes were full of a gentle pity that terrified her. He began to speak, using words she had heard in movies, but never in real life. Words like, "regret to inform you," and "on behalf of a grateful nation." The words were a low hum, a meaningless noise that buzzed around her head. She was not listening to the words. She was watching the man's mouth move. She was looking at the shiny brass buttons on his uniform. She was staring at a small piece of lint on the shoulder of the other soldier, the younger one, who stood silently behind him. Her brain refused to assemble the words into a sentence that made sense. It could not be true. It was a mistake. They had the wrong apartment. They had the wrong person. Leo was fine. He had just sent her an email. He told her about a flower. He was hiking. He was safe. But then the older soldier said his name. He said Leo's name. And the buzzing in her ears stopped. A terrible, crushing silence fell over the world. The man was still talking, but she could no longer hear him. All she could hear was the name, her brother's name, hanging in the air in the quiet hallway. The world tilted on its side. The hallway seemed to stretch and become very long. The patterned carpet on the floor swirled before her eyes. She felt a strange, cold feeling spread through her chest, a numbness that moved out to her fingers and toes. She was vaguely aware that she had dropped the small bouquet of flowers. The pink carnations and the green fern lay scattered on the floor by her feet. One of the soldiers bent down to pick them up, but she did not watch him. She was looking past them at the peeling paint on the wall behind them. She felt nothing. It was a vast, empty space where a feeling was supposed to be. She was floating, disconnected from her own body. The soldiers were saying more things. They were asking if there was someone they could call, a family member, a friend. She shook her head. There was only her and Leo. And now there was only her. They held out a neatly folded flag to her. The colors were bright, red, white, and blue. It felt heavy in her hands, impossibly heavy. She took it without a word. Her fingers were numb. She did not remember them leaving. One moment they were there, filling her hallway with their serious uniforms and their terrible, quiet words. The next moment, they were gone. The only sign they had ever been there was the heavy flag in her hands and the crushing silence they had left behind. She stood alone in the hallway for a long time. She did not know how long. Time had stopped working in the normal way. She looked down at the flag. She ran her hand over the stiff fabric. It was real. This was real. She finally turned and went inside her apartment, closing the door behind her. The click of the lock was loud in the silence. Her small apartment, usually her safe place, felt like a stranger's home. Everything was the same. A cup was on the counter, waiting to be filled with tea. A book was open on her small kitchen table. But everything was different. It was all from a time before the knock on the door, before the silence. She walked through the rooms, her hand trailing along the walls. She touched the back of her favorite armchair. She looked at the photograph on her bedside table. It was of her and Leo, taken a few years ago when he was home on leave. They were both smiling. He had his arm around her, squeezing her in a tight hug. His smile was big and bright and full of life. It was a punch to her stomach. She turned the photograph face down. She could not look at it. She sat on the edge of her bed for hours, holding the folded flag in her lap. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her, locked behind the wall of numb shock. The sun rose higher in the sky and light filled her apartment, but she did not see it. Her world had gone dark. The next few days were a blur of empty moments. The phone rang sometimes. She would listen to the voices of relatives she barely knew, offering words of sympathy that sounded like they were coming from a great distance. She would make the right sounds in response, a quiet thank you, a soft yes or no. But she was not really there. She was an observer in her own life. She did not eat. She did not sleep. The silence in her apartment grew deeper and heavier. It was not just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence. It was the silence of an email inbox that would never again have a new message from him. It was the silence of a phone that would never ring with his voice on the other end. It was the silence of a future that had been stolen. A week after the soldiers came, she knew she had to go back to work. Her money was running out. The idea of returning to the flower market was terrifying. It was her place, a place of comfort. But she knew it would be different now. She walked to the market in the dark, just as she always did. But the walk felt different. The quiet streets did not feel peaceful. They felt empty. When she stepped inside the warehouse, the blast of cold air and the overwhelming smell of flowers hit her like a physical blow. The scents that had once been a comfort, the earthy smell of stems and the sweet perfume of petals, now made her feel sick. The colors seemed too bright, too loud. The vibrant reds of the roses, the cheerful yellows of the daffodils, the pure whites of the lilies. It all felt like a lie. How could the world be so full of color when her own world was nothing but gray? She tried to work. She put on her apron and her gloves. She stood at her metal table. A co-worker, an older woman named Rosa, came over and put a gentle hand on her arm. She said she was sorry to hear about her brother. Willow just nodded, unable to speak. Rosa's kindness was a crack in the wall of her numbness, and she was afraid of what might pour out. She picked up a bunch of carnations. Their frilly edges seemed to mock her. She held the cutters in her hand, but her hand would not move. She looked at the flowers, at their senseless, stupid beauty, and a wave of anger washed over her. It was wrong. It was all wrong. He was gone, but these flowers were still here, living and breathing. She dropped the cutters on the table. They made a loud clatter in the quiet warehouse. She turned and walked out, ignoring the concerned calls of her manager. She could not be there. She could not touch another flower. Her place of peace had become a place of pain. The beauty felt like a cruelty. She walked home through the dark streets, and for the first time since the soldiers came to her door, the frozen tears began to melt. They ran down her face in hot, silent streams. She did not wipe them away. She just let them fall. The silence inside her was finally breaking, replaced by the raw, ragged sound of a heart tearing apart. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would never be the same. The girl who loved flowers was gone. The girl who left secret bouquets for strangers was gone. All that was left was the heavy silence and the impossible weight of a world without her brother in it. Chapter 2. A small brown packet. The days that followed were all the same. They were long, gray, and silent. Willow's small apartment became her entire world, a quiet box floating in a city she no longer belonged to. The sun would rise, casting a pale, indifferent light across her floor. It would crawl across the room during the day, a silent marker of time that had lost all meaning. Then it would set, and the darkness would press against her windows. Willow watched it all from her chair or from her bed. She did not separate the day from the night. They were just different kinds of emptiness. Time passed in a slow, thick drip. She did not count the days. It might have been a week. It might have been 3. The calendar on her wall was still turned to the month when Leo was alive. She never turned the page. In her mind, it was still that month. It would always be that month. Her small home began to show signs of her neglect. A thin layer of dust settled on every surface, on the book she used to love, on the small wooden table, on the screen of her television which was never turned on. In the kitchen, a bowl of fruit she had bought on her last trip to the store began to soften and change. The bright yellow of the bananas turned to a bruised, ugly brown. A fine blue fur grew on the skin of an orange. She looked at it sometimes, a small island of decay in the middle of her quiet life. She felt a strange connection to it. She felt like she was decaying too, from the inside out. Food was a problem. The thought of eating was exhausting. Her body felt heavy and useless, and she had no desire to give it fuel. Sometimes, hours would pass, and she would realize she had not eaten all day. She would go to the kitchen and open the refrigerator. The small light would hum to life, revealing shelves of food that seemed to belong to another person. A carton of eggs, a bottle of milk, a head of lettuce slowly wilting in its plastic bag. She would stand there, staring at it all, feeling nothing. She would close the door and go back to her chair. Most days, she survived on toast. It was easy. She would put a slice of bread in the toaster and wait for it to pop up. She would eat it plain, without butter. The dry, scratchy bread was hard to swallow, but it was something. It was enough to keep her body going, even when her mind had stopped. Sleep was no escape. It was a dark, heavy blanket that she would pull over her head, but it offered no rest. She had strange, broken dreams. They were not nightmares full of monsters or falling. They were quiet dreams, full of ordinary things that were now unbearable. She dreamed she was at the flower market, the scent of lilies thick in the air. She dreamed she was walking down her street on a sunny afternoon. She dreamed she heard the specific chime of her computer, the one that meant a new email had arrived. In her dreams, she would feel a moment of happiness, a flicker of her old life. She would reach for it, and then she would wake up, and the silence would rush back in, colder and heavier than before. Waking up was the worst part of the day. It was the moment of remembering. For a few seconds, in the fuzzy space between sleep and wakefulness, she would forget. And then the truth would crash down on her again. Leo was gone. He was gone. He was gone. The words would repeat in her head, a dull, steady drumbeat. She avoided the window. The world outside was moving on, and she could not bear to watch it. She could hear the sounds of life, the rumble of a bus, the distant wail of a siren, the laughter of children playing in the park across the street. These sounds were like a language she no longer understood. They belonged to a world that was bright and alive, a world that continued to spin even though hers had stopped. People tried to reach her. Her phone would vibrate against the wooden table. She would look at the screen and see names. Her aunt, a cousin, a friend from high school she had not spoken to in years. She never answered. What could she say? Their voices would be full of pity. Their words would be clumsy and useless. They would tell her he was in a better place. They would tell her that time heals all wounds. They were just words. They were sounds people made when they did not know what else to do. They could not fix the huge gaping hole that had been torn in her life. So she let the phone ring until it stopped. After a while, it rang less often. People moved on with their lives. She was grateful for that. The silence was easier to bear than the sound of their useless comfort. The only person she wanted to talk to was the one person she could never speak to again. One afternoon, a loud knock came at her door. It was not a polite, gentle knock. It was a hard, official sound that seemed to shake the whole apartment. Willow's heart jumped into her throat. For a wild, stupid moment, she thought it was them again. The soldiers. She thought they had come back to tell her it was all a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake. She ran to the door, her hands shaking. She looked through the peephole. It was not a soldier. It was a delivery man in a brown uniform. He held a large cardboard box in his hands. He looked impatient. He knocked again, louder this time. She opened the door just a crack. The man looked at a clipboard. He asked for her name. She whispered it. He grunted and pushed the box towards her. He told her to sign a small electronic screen with a plastic pen. Her hand was shaking so much she could barely write her name. The signature was a jagged, meaningless scribble. The man did not seem to care. He turned and walked away without another word. Willow was left standing in her doorway with a large box at her feet. It was a plain brown cardboard box. It was sealed with wide strips of thick, clear tape. There were official-looking labels on it, with codes and numbers and military addresses. She did not understand. But she understood what it was. She knew immediately. It was him. It was what was left of him. It was the small, ordinary things that had made up his life. She managed to drag the box inside. It was not heavy with weight, but it felt impossibly heavy with meaning. She pushed it into the center of her small living room, and there it sat. For 3 full days, the box sat in the middle of her floor. It was a silent monument to her loss. It was the first thing she saw when she got out of bed. It was the last thing she saw before she closed her eyes. It was a constant, physical presence that filled her small apartment with a suffocating sadness. She walked around it. She sometimes reached out a hand and touched the rough cardboard. It felt warm from the sun coming through the window. It felt like a sleeping thing. She was terrified of it. She knew that inside that box was a world of pain. Inside that box were memories that would feel like knives. Opening it would be the final act of acceptance. As long as the box was sealed, she could pretend. She could pretend that it was just a box. She could pretend that he was just on a long mission, unable to send an email. But if she opened it, she would have to face the truth. The things inside were all that was left. On the fourth day, she woke up and knew she had to do it. She could not live with that box in the middle of her room anymore. She could not live with the fear of it. The pain of not knowing was becoming worse than the pain she was sure she would find inside. She went to the kitchen and took a small knife from the drawer. Her hands were surprisingly steady. She knelt on the floor beside the box. She took a deep breath. The air in the room felt thick and hard to breathe. She looked at the tape. It was so strong, so secure. It was holding a life inside. She pierced the tape with the point of the knife. The sound of the plastic ripping was loud and violent in the quiet room. It sounded like a scream. She sliced through the tape on one side and then the other. She folded back the cardboard flaps. She looked inside. For a moment, she saw only neatly folded clothes and the corner of a book. Then the smell hit her. It was his smell. It was not strong, just a faint, lingering scent. It was a mix of laundry soap, dry dust, and something that was just him. It was the smell of his hugs, the smell of his old bedroom. A wave of grief so powerful, it felt like a physical blow slammed into her. She fell back, away from the box, gasping for air. The tears she had been holding back for weeks finally came. They were not quiet, gentle tears. They were loud, ragged sobs that tore through her body. She curled up on the floor and cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen shut. She cried for her brother. She cried for the future they would never have. She cried for the unbearable, crushing loneliness of being left behind. When the tears finally stopped, she was exhausted. Her body felt empty and weak. But the fear was gone. It had been washed away by the storm of her grief. She crawled back over to the box. She was ready now. She reached inside and, one by one, she began to take out the pieces of his life. The first thing she touched was a stack of t-shirts. They were neatly folded. She picked up the one on top. It was a soft, faded gray shirt with the name of a band he loved on the front. She unfolded it and held it up. It looked so big. She remembered him wearing this shirt. He wore it all the time. She buried her face in the soft cotton. She breathed in deeply. The faint smell of him was still there. It was like a ghost of a hug. She held the shirt for a long time, rocking back and forth on the floor. Next, she found his dog tags. They were on a thin metal chain. They were cold to the touch. His name was stamped into the metal, along with a series of numbers. It was so impersonal, so military, but it was his name. She clutched them in her hand, the sharp edges of the metal plates pressed into her palm. It was a small, sharp pain that helped to ground her. It reminded her that this was real. Then she saw the book. It was a paperback copy of an old adventure novel. The cover was creased and the corners were soft and worn. This was his favorite book. It was a story about explorers and forgotten lands that they had read together as children, over and over again. She remembered lying on the floor of his bedroom, taking turns reading the chapters aloud. He would do all the voices, making the pirates sound gruff and the heroes sound brave. She would laugh until her stomach hurt. She opened the book. The pages were yellowed and smelled of old paper. He had written notes in the margins in his messy, hurried handwriting. He would argue with the characters or underline sentences he thought were funny. It was like having a conversation with him. She could almost hear his voice reading the words. She traced his handwriting with her finger. It was another piece of him, left behind on a page. Under the book was a photograph. It was the one from her bedside table, the one she had turned face down. But this was his copy. It was slightly faded from the sun. It was the two of them, on a pier by the lake, the summer before he left for his final tour. He had his arm around her, and he was smiling that big, goofy smile of his. She looked so happy in the photo, so carefree. She had no idea what was coming. She looked at the girl in the picture, and she felt like she was looking at a stranger. Who was that person who could smile so easily? Had she ever really been that light? The memory of that day was so clear. It had been warm and sunny. They had eaten ice cream that melted and dripped down their hands. He had told her a stupid joke, and she had laughed so hard she snorted, which only made him laugh harder. It was a perfect, ordinary day. The kind of day she had taken for granted. The kind of day she would give anything to have back. She put the photograph down gently, as if it were a fragile piece of glass. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a sock, was a small, smooth stone. It was a dark gray color with a single white line running through it. It was perfectly shaped, worn smooth by water and time. It fit perfectly in the palm of her hand. She remembered his last email, the one about the hike into the hills. He had written about the rocks and the landscape. This must be a stone from one of those mountains. She closed her hand around it. It felt cool and solid. It was a piece of the world he had seen, a world she only knew from his words. She held the stone and tried to imagine him. She saw him walking on a dusty trail, the sun bright in the sky. She saw him looking down and seeing this stone. She saw him bending over to pick it up, feeling its smoothness and slipping it into his pocket. Maybe he was thinking of her at that moment. Maybe he had saved it to give to her when he came home. The thought was both a comfort and a fresh wave of pain. He was never coming home. She sat on the floor for hours, surrounded by these small treasures. The shirt, the dog tags, the book, the photograph, the stone. They were not just things. They were stories. They were memories. They were all that was left of a life. Her grief was a vast, empty ocean, and these small things were like tiny islands she could cling to. They were proof that he had been real, that their love had been real. The sun began to set, and her apartment filled with long, soft shadows. She decided she should put the things away. It was too painful to leave them out. She carefully folded the t-shirt and placed it back in the box. She put the dog tags, the photo, and the stone next to it. She picked up the worn paperback book. As she held it, it fell open to a page near the middle, and that is when she saw it. Tucked between the pages was a small, flat packet. It was made of plain brown paper. It was folded neatly in half. It was so small, so unassuming, she had almost missed it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. It was a seed packet. She could feel the small, hard shapes of seeds inside. On the front of the packet, written in his familiar, messy handwriting, were a few simple words. It was a note, a final message. It said, "For your garden, Wills. The locals call them night flowers. Said they like the dark, just like you." Willow read the words over and over again, her vision blurred with fresh tears, but these tears felt different. They were not the hot, angry tears of grief. They were soft and warm. He had written this for her. Sometime before the end, he had taken the time to find these seeds and write her this note. He had been thinking of her. He knew her so well. He knew she loved to grow things. And his gentle joke that she liked the dark was so perfectly him. It was a little piece of his voice, speaking directly to her from a world away. She held the small brown packet in the palm of her hand. It felt like the most precious thing in the world. In the middle of all the painful endings in the box, here was a beginning. In the middle of all the things that spoke of a life that was over, here was the promise of a new one. The seeds were so small. They were just tiny dark specks. They did not look like much, but they were something. They were a connection. They were a task, a purpose, a last gift from her brother. The heavy, suffocating blanket of her grief did not disappear. The pain was still there, a deep ache in her chest. But for the first time in weeks, a tiny pinprick of light appeared in the darkness. It was not hope. It was not happiness. It was just a single, clear thought. She had to make them grow. She had to. For him. Holding the small brown packet, Willow felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt a reason to see the next sunrise. Chapter 3. The Unforgiving Earth. The small brown packet of seeds sat on Willow's kitchen table. It lay next to the open book, a tiny, silent promise in the middle of her quiet, gray world. For a full day, she did nothing but look at it. The first light of morning touched it, making the brown paper seem almost golden. The shadows of the afternoon stretched across it. The dim light of her evening lamp pooled around it. It was the center of her universe. The grief had not gone away. It was a heavy coat she still wore, a constant weight on her shoulders. But the seed packet was something she could hold. It was a task. It was the last sentence in her long conversation with her brother. He had sent her a final piece of his world, and it was now her job to make it live in hers. This thought, this heavy sense of duty, was the first thing that felt solid in weeks. It was an anchor in the shifting, foggy sea of her sorrow. The next morning, she woke up with a clear purpose in her head. It was a small purpose, but it was enough. Today, she would plant the seeds. This simple decision created a cascade of problems. She needed a pot. She looked around her small apartment. She was not a gardener. She loved flowers, but she had never grown anything from a seed in her life. She looked on her small balcony, a concrete slab that faced a brick wall. There were no pots there. She looked under her kitchen sink, behind the cleaning supplies. She found an old plastic bucket, but it had a crack in it. Finally, she remembered. In the very back of her closet, on the top shelf, was a small terracotta pot. It had been a gift from a neighbor years ago, with a small cactus in it. The cactus had died quickly, and she had put the pot away and forgotten about it. She stood on a chair and reached for it, her fingers brushing against thick layers of dust. She pulled the pot down. It was a simple, reddish-brown clay pot with a small hole in the bottom for drainage. It was dusty and had a faint white ring around the inside from old water. It was perfect. She took it to the kitchen sink and washed it carefully, scrubbing it with a brush until the clay was clean and bright. She let it dry on the counter, a small, hopeful object in a room that had seen no hope for a very long time. Next, she needed soil. This was a much bigger problem. Soil did not just appear in a third-floor apartment. She would have to go outside. She would have to go to a store. She would have to talk to a person. The thought made her stomach tighten with anxiety. She had not left her building, except for that one terrible trip to the flower market, in weeks. Her apartment was her safe place, her cocoon. The world outside was loud and bright and full of people who were living their lives, a world that did not know or care about the huge hole in hers. She stood by her front door for a long time, her hand on the doorknob. She could hear the muffled sounds of the city through the door, a car horn, the distant sound of a dog barking. She took a deep breath. She thought of Leo's handwriting on the small paper packet. "For your garden, Wills." This was for him. She opened the door. The light in the hallway seemed painfully bright. The air felt strange. She walked down the stairs, her steps feeling slow and heavy, as if she were walking through deep water. The street was a shock to her system. The sunlight was sharp and made her squint. The noise was a physical assault, a wall of sounds that pressed in on her from all sides. Cars rushed past. People walked quickly, their faces set with purpose. The colors were too vivid. A bright red sign on a shop, a woman's yellow coat, a blue bicycle leaning against a wall. It was too much. She felt exposed, as if everyone could see the grief she wore like a second skin. She pulled her sweater tighter around herself and kept her eyes on the pavement in front of her. There was a small hardware store a few blocks away. She walked there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt so alone, so disconnected from the river of life flowing around her. When she entered the store, the smell of sawdust and metal was sharp and clean. A man in a blue vest asked if she needed help. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. She found the gardening section in the back. It was a small aisle filled with bags of soil, watering cans, and strange-looking tools. She looked at the bags of soil. There were so many kinds. Potting mix, garden soil, soil for cactuses, soil for vegetables. She had no idea what to choose. They all had pictures of bright, happy flowers on them. It felt like another lie. She chose a small bag that said, all-purpose potting mix. It seemed like the safest choice. She carried the bag to the front of the store. It was surprisingly heavy. The cashier was a young woman with bright pink hair who was chewing gum. She did not look at Willow. She scanned the bag of soil and told her the price. Willow paid with cash, her hands fumbling with the money. She did not say a word. The cashier gave her the change and a receipt. The whole interaction took less than a minute, but it left Willow feeling shaky and exhausted. The walk home felt even longer. The bag of soil was awkward to carry. It bumped against her leg with every step. By the time she got back to her apartment and closed the door behind her, she felt as if she had run a marathon. She leaned against the door, breathing heavily, and slid to the floor. She had done it. She had gone outside. She had bought the soil. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. She brought the pot and the bag of soil to her small kitchen table. She laid down some old newspaper to protect the wood. She cut open the bag of soil. A rich, earthy smell filled the air. It was a clean, living smell, so different from the stale, dusty air of her apartment. She scooped the dark, crumbly soil into the pot with her hands. She loved the feeling of it, cool and slightly damp against her skin. It felt real. It felt ancient. She filled the pot almost to the top, pressing the soil down gently. Then she took the small brown packet. She opened it with the care of someone handling a precious jewel. She poured the seeds into the palm of her hand. There were only 6 of them. They were tiny and black, smaller than a grain of rice. They looked so fragile, so insignificant. It was hard to believe that life was curled up inside them. One by one, she placed the seeds on top of the soil. She spaced them out evenly. Then she pushed each one down gently, just under the surface, covering them with a thin blanket of earth. She had made them a home. She filled a glass with water and slowly, carefully watered the soil. She watched the water sink in, turning the dark brown soil to a deep, wet black. She placed the pot on her sunniest windowsill, a spot that got light in the late afternoon. And then she waited. The wait was a new kind of torture. It was a quiet, constant ache of anticipation. The pot on her windowsill became the new center of her world. It was the first thing she looked at when she woke up, and the last thing she looked at before she went to bed. Her days developed a new rhythm, a rhythm based on the needs of a few invisible seeds. She would check the soil every few hours, touching it with her finger. Was it too dry? Was it too wet? She worried about the sun. Was it too much? Was it not enough? She would move the pot from one side of the windowsill to the other, chasing the patch of sunlight as it moved across her apartment. She talked to the pot sometimes, in a low whisper when she was sure no one could hear. She would tell the seeds about Leo. She would tell them how much he would want them to grow. She told them they were special. She told them they were her only hope. The days dripped by, one after the other. 3 days, 4 days, a week. Nothing happened. The surface of the soil remained a flat, unbroken expanse of brown. There was no sign of life, not a single tiny green shoot. The hope that had been a small, warm flame inside her began to flicker. Doubt, cold and heavy, began to creep in. Maybe the seeds were too old. Maybe they had been damaged on their long journey. Maybe she was doing something wrong. A second week passed. The soil in the pot began to look tired and stale. A tiny patch of white, fuzzy mold appeared in one corner. Willow scraped it away with a spoon, her heart sinking. The pot was no longer a symbol of hope. It was becoming a symbol of her failure. Every time she looked at it, the blank, empty soil seemed to mock her. It was another silence in her life, another place where she was waiting for a response that would never come. Her brief, fragile sense of purpose began to crumble. The heavy blanket of grief, which had lifted just a little, settled back down around her, heavier than before. She felt a familiar, crushing despair. She had failed him. This one last task he had given her, this one small thing she was supposed to do for him, and she could not even do that. The anger she had felt at the flower market came back, but this time it was directed at herself. She was useless. She could not even make a tiny seed grow. The pain of it was sharp and bitter. She stopped checking the pot as often. Sometimes a whole day would go by when she did not look at it at all. She would walk past the windowsill and turn her head away, unwilling to face the small, round monument to her failure. The world outside her window continued on. She heard the sounds of spring beginning to arrive. The birds sang in the morning. The air that came through her open window was a little warmer. But inside her apartment, it was still winter. One morning, she woke up and decided she could not look at the pot for one more day. It was a constant, painful reminder of what she had lost and what she could not do. She walked over to the windowsill and picked it up. The pot felt heavy in her hands, full of dead earth and broken promises. She carried it over to the trash can in her kitchen. She would just throw it away. She would throw it all away and go back to the gray numbness. It would be easier. She held the pot over the open bin. She tilted it, ready to dump the unforgiving soil and the 6 tiny, useless seeds into the garbage. But then she stopped. Her eyes fell on the small brown paper packet that was still lying on her kitchen table. Leo's handwriting was there, plain and clear. Said they like the dark, just like you. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes. She could not do it. She could not throw it away. It was not just dirt and seeds. It was the last piece of him. Throwing it away would feel like throwing him away all over again. She put the pot back down on the counter. She sank into a kitchen chair and put her head in her hands. She could not give up. But she did not know what else to do. She had tried her best, and it was not good enough. The thought came to her slowly, a small, logical idea in the middle of her emotional storm. Love was not enough. Duty was not enough. Wishing for it to grow was not enough. She needed knowledge. She needed to understand what she was doing wrong. For the first time in over a month, she went to her small desk and opened her laptop. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. She wiped it clean with the sleeve of her sweater. When she turned it on, the screen glowed to life, painfully bright in her dim apartment. The computer was slow to wake up. It was full of notifications and reminders from her old life. Emails from the flower market, updates from social media sites, a calendar reminder for a dentist appointment she had missed. She ignored it all. She opened a web browser. The search bar blinked at her, a blank white space waiting for a question. She typed in the words, "night flowers." The results filled the page in an instant. There were links to flower delivery services that were open late. There were articles about common flowers that bloomed at night, like jasmine and moonflowers. She looked at the pictures. They were beautiful, but they were not right. None of them seemed like the kind of tough, special flower Leo would have found growing on a mountain. She tried other searches. She tried "mountain flowers from" and the name of the country where he had been stationed. She found websites with lists of native plants, full of scientific Latin names she did not understand. She scrolled through hundreds of pictures of small, hardy flowers. None of them seemed right. There was no mention anywhere of a flower that liked the dark. The internet, the place that was supposed to have all the answers, had no answer for her. The frustration was a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. The next day, she decided to try the library. It was an old, desperate idea, but it was the only one she had. The walk to the library was just as hard as the walk to the hardware store. The world was still too loud, too bright. The library was a huge old building made of stone, with wide steps leading up to giant wooden doors. Inside, it was blessedly quiet. The air smelled of old paper and floor polish. It was a calm, serious place, and for the first time in a long time, she felt her shoulders relax just a little. She found the section on botany. It was a tall aisle of shelves filled with heavy, serious-looking books. She pulled one out. It was heavy in her hands. She carried it to a large wooden table in a quiet corner and sat down. She opened the book. The pages were filled with beautiful, detailed drawings of plants, with their parts all labeled with precise, scientific names. She spent hours in that quiet corner. She looked through book after book. She saw pictures of flowers from all over the world. Flowers that grew in jungles, flowers that grew in deserts, flowers that grew in swamps. She learned the names of plants she had never heard of, but she found no mention of a night flower. There was nothing that matched her brother's description. The library, for all its collected wisdom, for all its silent, heavy books, held no answers for her either. She left as the sun was setting, feeling more lost and defeated than ever. The seeds were a mystery, a secret she could not unlock on her own. On her walk home, she took a different route. She did not want to walk down the same busy streets. She turned down a small side street she did not usually take, and that is when she saw it. Tucked between two tall, gray apartment buildings was a splash of impossible color. It was a community garden. She had seen it before, from a distance, but she had never really looked at it. It was a small, square patch of land, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Inside, the ground was divided into dozens of small, neat plots. Things were growing there. Bright green lettuce, the tall, feathery tops of carrots, rows of bright red tulips, and cheerful yellow daffodils. There were people in the garden, even though it was getting dark. They were older people mostly, bending over their small plots of earth, their hands in the dirt. They moved slowly, peacefully. It was a small, quiet world of life and growth, a tiny green heart in the middle of the concrete city. She stood there for a long time, on the other side of the fence, just watching. And a new idea, a terrifying idea, began to form in her mind. What if she asked for help? The next day, she went back to the garden. She walked there with the small pot in her hands. She held it with both hands, like an offering. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird in her chest. The thought of talking to a stranger, of asking for help, was almost more than she could bear. But the image of the blank soil in her pot was worse. She pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The air in the garden was different. It smelled of damp earth, of green growing things, and of the city all at once. A few people looked up as she came in. They gave her small, curious smiles. She ignored them, her eyes scanning the garden for someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. Then she saw him. He was an old man kneeling by a patch of tomato plants. He was much older than the others, with a face full of deep wrinkles and a crown of thick white hair. His hands, which were covered in dirt, were large and gnarled, but they moved with a gentle, expert precision as he tied a young tomato vine to a wooden stake. He had a stern, focused look on his face. He looked serious. He looked like he would not waste his time with foolish questions. He looked like he might have answers. She walked towards him, her feet feeling like lead. She stopped a few feet away from his plot. He did not look up. He continued with his work, his attention completely on the small green plant in front of him. She stood there for a full minute in complete silence, trying to find her voice. Finally, she managed to speak. Her voice came out as a small, shaky whisper. "Excuse me," she said. The man did not move for a moment. Then, with a slow, stiff groan, he pushed himself up from his knees. He turned to look at her. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, and they were sharp and intelligent. He looked at her, and then down at the pot she was holding. His expression did not change. It was a stern, unreadable mask. "What do you want?" he said. His voice was rough, like gravel. It was not a friendly voice. I need help," Willow stammered. "I'm trying to grow these, and they won't grow." The old man looked at the pot again. He snorted, a small, sharp sound of dismissal. "You're giving it too much water," he said, turning back to his tomatoes. "Go home. Leave it alone. It'll either grow or it won't." He was dismissing her. The rejection was a sharp physical pain. She felt the familiar sting of tears in her eyes, but she did not leave. She could not. This was her last chance. She just stood there, holding the pot, the silence stretching between them. After a long moment, the man sighed, a long, weary sound. He turned back to her, a flicker of annoyance in his pale blue eyes. "What?" he said, his voice sharp. Willow did not try to explain. She did not tell him about her brother. She did not tell him about the box, or the note, or the crushing weight of her grief. She just held out the small brown paper packet, which she had tucked into her pocket. Her hand was trembling. The man looked at her outstretched hand. He looked at the small, folded piece of paper. He hesitated for a moment. Then he wiped his dirty hand on his pants and took the packet from her. He unfolded it carefully. He looked at the seeds, which she had put back inside. He held them up to the fading light. He rolled one of the tiny black seeds between his thumb and forefinger. He brought it up to his nose and sniffed it. His stern expression changed. A flicker of something new appeared in his eyes. Curiosity. He looked from the seed to the note, reading Leo's messy handwriting. Then he looked up at Willow. He really looked at her this time. He did not just see a young woman with a pot of dirt. He saw the deep, raw desperation in her eyes. He saw the dark circles of sleepless nights. He saw the profound, bone-deep sadness that she carried with her. His gaze softened just for a second. The stern mask cracked, and she saw a flicker of something ancient and sad in his own eyes, a shared understanding of loss that needed no words. He folded the paper packet carefully and handed it back to her. He was silent for a long time. Willow held her breath. Finally, he spoke. His voice was still rough, but the sharp edge of annoyance was gone. "I've never seen seeds like this before," he said quietly. He looked at the pot of soil in her hands. "This soil is wrong. The pot is wrong. The light is wrong. You're doing it all wrong." Then he looked at her again. "Come back tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll start over." He turned back to his tomatoes, his shoulders hunched, as if the conversation had cost him a great deal of energy. He did not say another word. He did not need to. Willow stood there for a moment longer, clutching the pot and the seed packet. It was not a warm invitation. It was not a promise of success. But it was not a dismissal. It was a chance. And a chance was more than she had had in a very long time. She turned and walked out of the garden, her feet feeling lighter than they had in months. For the first time, she was not alone with her grief. She had asked for help, and help had answered. Chapter 4. Building a Home for a Memory. The next morning, Willow woke before her alarm. The sun was not yet up, but a soft gray light filtered through her window. For the first time in a long time, she did not lie in bed, waiting for the heavy weight of the day to settle on her. She got up immediately. She dressed in old clothes that she did not mind getting dirty. She did not look in the mirror. She made a piece of dry toast and ate it while standing in her kitchen, her mind focused on one thing: the garden. She walked the quiet, empty streets as the city was just beginning to wake. The air was cool and smelled of damp pavement. When she arrived at the community garden, the gate was unlocked, but no one else was there yet. The only sound was the distant hum of the city and the cheerful, insistent singing of birds. She saw the old man. He was already there. He was not working on his own plot. He was standing by a small, empty patch of earth in a far corner of the garden. It was the worst plot in the whole place. It was overgrown with thick, tough-looking weeds, and the soil looked pale and hard. A broken piece of a plastic chair lay half buried in the dirt. The old man was waiting for her. He did not say hello. He just nodded at her, and then at the sad, neglected piece of ground. He began to speak. His voice was low and rough, and he did not waste words. He explained that the seeds she had were not from this part of the world. They were from a place with thin air and rocky soil. They were from a place where the sun was fierce during the day and the nights were cold. He said the city was a poison to plants like that. The air was full of fumes. The soil was heavy and wet. The light was filtered through a haze of pollution. He told her that the all-purpose soil she had bought was useless. It was designed to hold water, to be easy and forgiving for common flowers. Her seeds, he said, did not want an easy life. They wanted to struggle a little. They needed soil that would drain quickly, soil that was more like sand and grit than rich black earth. He bent down and picked up a handful of the pale, hard dirt from the neglected plot. He let it run through his fingers. It fell in heavy clumps. "This is what you have to fight," he said. He told her she needed to build a new world for her seeds, a small, perfect world, right here in the middle of the city. She needed to create the right soil, she needed to control the water, and most importantly, she needed to protect the plants from the harsh city air. He pointed at the sky, at the pale gray layer that hung over the buildings. "That is your enemy," he said. Then he turned and walked back to his own plot, leaving her alone with the weeds and the hard, unforgiving earth. His lesson was over. The first step was to claim the plot. There was a small shed near the gate that served as the garden's office. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile sat at a small desk. She was the garden coordinator. Willow had to fill out a form with her name and address. Her hand shook as she wrote. It had been so long since she had written her own name on an official piece of paper. It felt strange, like she was pretending to be a real person. She paid a small fee for the year. The money came from the small amount of savings she had left. It was an investment in a future she could not yet imagine. The woman gave her a small, laminated tag with a number on it. This was her plot number. She told her the rules of the garden. Water was free from the taps. Everyone had to help keep the paths clear. Be respectful of your neighbors. The woman's voice was gentle, and she did not ask any questions. She just smiled, and for a moment, Willow felt a tiny flicker of connection to this small community. She was one of them now. She had a place. She walked back to her plot and tied the small tag to the chain-link fence. It was official. This sad, forgotten piece of the earth was hers. Now the real work began. The weeds. They were a thick, tangled jungle. Some of them had deep, thick taproots that seemed to go down forever. Others had thin, creeping roots that formed a dense mat just below the surface. She started with her bare hands. She grabbed a thick stalk and pulled. The weed resisted. It was anchored to the earth with a strength that was surprising. She pulled harder, bracing her feet, leaning her whole body back. The roots began to give way, and with a final grunting pull, the weed came free, spraying her face with loose dirt. She fell backwards, the huge weed in her hands. Its root was long and pale and ugly. She looked at the hole it had left in the ground. One weed. There were hundreds more. For the rest of the day, she pulled weeds. It was slow, painful, exhausting work. The tough stems scratched her arms. The rough leaves made her hands raw. Her back began to ache from bending over. Her knees were sore from kneeling on the hard ground. But she did not stop. The physical pain was a strange kind of relief. It was a simple, clean pain, so different from the complicated, heavy ache of her grief. The sun came up, and the garden began to fill with other people. They worked on their own plots, their movements slow and practiced. They did not speak to her, but she could feel their quiet presence. It was comforting. She was not alone in her work. By the end of the day, she had cleared a small corner of the plot. It was not much, but it was a start. Her hands were blistered and her muscles screamed with a fatigue she had not felt in years. It was a good kind of tired. It was the tiredness of accomplishment. That night, she did not lie awake for hours, her mind circling the same dark thoughts. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep the moment her head hit the pillow. The next day, she was back. And the day after that, weeding became her whole life. It was a battle. She and the earth were locked in a slow, stubborn fight. She learned the different kinds of weeds, the ones that looked soft but had sharp thorns hidden under their leaves, the ones that broke off at the surface, leaving their roots behind to grow again, the ones that wrapped themselves around other plants, choking the life out of them. She began to see the weeds as a physical representation of her sorrow. The deep, stubborn roots were the oldest parts of her pain. The creeping, tangling weeds were the confusing, everyday sadness that tripped her up. Pulling them out was a way of fighting back. With every weed she tore from the earth, she felt a tiny bit lighter. She was not just clearing a patch of ground. She was clearing a space in her own heart. After a week of pulling weeds, the plot was finally clear. It was just a square of bare, pale earth. It looked raw and vulnerable. Now she had to dig. The old man, whose name she learned was Mr. Henderson, had told her she needed to turn the soil over to a depth of at least a foot. He lent her a tool. It was a spading fork, heavy and made of old steel, with a worn wooden handle. The tool felt good in her hands. It felt serious. She pushed the tines of the fork into the hard ground with her foot. The earth resisted. She had to put her whole weight on it to make it go in. Then she had to pull back on the handle, using her tired leg muscles to pry up a huge, heavy clump of soil. She would lift it, turn it over, and drop it back into the hole. The sound of the fork hitting the earth, the groan of the roots as they tore, the heavy thud of the overturned soil. These sounds became the rhythm of her days. It was back-breaking work. Sweat dripped from her forehead and ran into her eyes. Her hands, which were used to the delicate work of handling flowers, became rough and calloused. She found things buried in the soil. A smooth gray stone, a shard of blue glass worn soft by the earth, a rusty bottle cap. Each object was a small surprise, a piece of a forgotten story. She found a long pink earthworm and she watched, fascinated, as it wriggled back into the safety of the dark soil. She was disturbing a hidden world. She was waking something up. As she dug, she began to feel a connection to the earth that she had never felt before. She was not just working on it, she was working with it. She could feel its cool, damp breath. She could smell its rich, living scent. Her own sadness, her own small human problems began to feel smaller in comparison. The earth was so old, so patient. It had seen so much. Her own grief was just one small story in a world full of stories. The thought was not sad. It was comforting. It helped to put her own pain in its place. After days of digging, the entire plot was turned over. The soil was loose and broken. It was a start, but it was not the right kind of soil. Now she had to build the soil Mr. Henderson had described. She needed sand to help the water drain. She needed compost for nutrients. She needed peat moss to keep it from becoming too dense. This meant another trip out into the world. She went to a large garden supply store in the suburbs. It was a huge, overwhelming place, a warehouse filled with everything you could ever need to tame the natural world. She bought large, heavy bags of coarse sand, rich black compost, and fibrous peat moss. She used more of her savings. She had to take a taxi to get it all back to the garden. The taxi driver helped her unload the heavy bags. He was a kind man with a friendly smile. He did not ask her what she was doing. He just wished her good luck. It was another small, positive interaction that made the world feel a little less hostile. She spent the next 2 days mixing her new soil. She did it right there, on a large plastic sheet next to her plot. She would pour a pile of the old, pale city dirt. Then she would add a bucket of sand, a bucket of compost, a bucket of peat moss. She would mix it all together with a shovel, and then with her hands. It was like baking a cake for the earth. She loved the feel of the different textures, the grittiness of the sand, the rich, crumbly feel of the compost, the light, springy texture of the peat moss. She was not following a precise recipe. She was doing it by feel, just as Mr. Henderson had told her to. She would pick up a handful of the mixed soil and let it run through her fingers. Was it too heavy? Did it hold its shape too much? She slowly, painstakingly mixed batch after batch until the entire pile of old soil was transformed. What she had now was a beautiful, dark, and crumbly soil that smelled rich and alive. It was the perfect home for her seeds. She carefully shoveled the new soil into her plot, filling it up until it was a raised bed, a clean, dark rectangle in the middle of the garden. The work was done. She had made the earth ready, but she still had to protect it from the sky. Mr. Henderson had been very clear about this. The seeds needed a special environment. They needed high humidity, and they needed to be shielded from the city air. They needed a greenhouse, a small one, just big enough to cover her plot. Willow had never built anything in her life. The idea was terrifying. But the thought of her seeds failing again was even more terrifying. So she began to plan. She measured her plot carefully. She drew a small, clumsy sketch of a simple box frame with a sloped roof. Then she went back to the hardware store. This time she was not as afraid. She walked into the bright, noisy store with a sense of purpose. She had a list. She needed wood for the frame. She needed screws. She needed hinges for a small door. And she needed a roll of thick, clear plastic sheeting to cover it all. The store was a confusing labyrinth of aisles. She got lost trying to find the right kind of wood. She stood for a long time in the aisle of screws, staring at the hundreds of small boxes, completely overwhelmed. Just as she was about to give up, a young man who worked there approached her. He had a friendly, open face and a name tag that said, David. He asked if she needed help. This time, Willow did not shake her head. She took a deep breath, and in a quiet voice, she explained what she was trying to build. She showed him her clumsy drawing. He did not laugh. He looked at it seriously, nodding his head. He was kind and patient. He showed her the right kind of wood to use, wood that would not rot in the damp garden. He helped her choose the right length of screws. He showed her a simple way to build a door. He treated her small, strange project with a gentle respect that made her feel capable and strong. She left the store with a pile of lumber, a box of screws, and a new, fragile sense of confidence. Building the greenhouse was the hardest thing she had ever done. It took her over a week. She worked from early in the morning until the sun went down. Nothing was easy. She did not have the right tools. Mr. Henderson lent her an old handsaw and a screwdriver. The saw was hard to use. Her cuts were never perfectly straight. Her arm ached from the repetitive motion. She would measure a piece of wood twice, just as David at the hardware store had told her to, but she would still sometimes cut it too short. The frustration was immense. There were moments when she wanted to scream and kick the whole flimsy structure apart. There were times when she sat down in the dirt and cried, convinced that she was too stupid, too weak to do this. But she never gave up. Every time she felt like quitting, she would touch the small brown paper packet in her pocket. She would think of Leo, and she would pick up the saw and try again. The other gardeners watched her. They were a quiet, observant audience. They never offered advice unless she asked for it, but they helped her in small, silent ways. One afternoon, when she was struggling to hold two pieces of wood together while trying to put in a screw, a man from a nearby plot came over. He was a big, strong man with a gentle face. He did not say a word. He just took one piece of the wood and held it steady for her while she drove the screw in. When she was done, he nodded at her and went back to his own garden. Another time, on a particularly hot day, an old woman with a bright flowered hat brought her a tall glass of cold water with a slice of lemon in it. She just placed it on the edge of the wooden frame and smiled at Willow before walking away. These small acts of kindness were like water on her own thirsty soul. She was becoming part of the garden's quiet rhythm. They had accepted her. They understood that her work was important. They did not need to know why. Mr. Henderson watched her the most. He would stand by his tomato plants, pretending to work, but she knew he was watching her every move. He never praised her. But sometimes, when she finished a particularly difficult part of the frame, she would glance over and see him give a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the encouragement she needed. Slowly, painfully, the structure began to take shape. It was not perfect. The corners were not perfectly square. Some of the screws were driven in at a slight angle, but it was sturdy. It was strong. The final step was to cover the frame with the thick plastic sheeting. This was a difficult, clumsy job. The plastic was hard to handle, and the wind kept catching it like a sail. But she managed, using a staple gun to attach the plastic tightly to the wooden frame. She built a small, simple door with hinges, just as the young man at the hardware store had shown her. When she was finally finished, she stepped back and looked at what she had made. It was a small, simple structure, a box of wood and plastic sitting on a patch of dark, rich earth. It was clumsy. It was imperfect, but it was hers. She had built it with her own two hands. She had taken her grief and her anger and her frustration and she had turned them into something real, something solid. She had built a home for a memory. She stood there as the sun began to set, casting a long shadow from her small greenhouse across the garden. She was covered in sawdust and dirt. Her muscles ached. Her hands were sore. But she was not sad. In that moment, standing in front of the small, clumsy house she had built, Willow felt a flicker of something she had not felt since before the soldiers came to her door. She felt a small, quiet, and deeply satisfying sense of peace. The hardest part was over. She had prepared the way. Chapter 5. The First Green Sign. The greenhouse stood finished. It was a small, clumsy monument to a week of hard, focused work. It was a house built not of skill, but of pure, stubborn will. For a full day after she finished it, Willow did not go near it. She stayed in her apartment. She needed a day of rest, a day for the aches in her muscles to soften, a day for the blisters on her hands to begin to heal. But it was more than that. She was afraid. She had done everything she could. She had fought the weeds and turned the soil. She had mixed a new earth, a special earth. She had built a shelter to protect it. She had prepared a home. Now, the final and most important step was here. It was time to plant the seeds. And she was terrified, because after this, there was nothing more she could do. After this, it was out of her hands. All of her work, all of her effort, all of her fragile, newly found hope could end in a final, silent failure. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. If the seeds did not grow this time, in this perfect little world she had built for them, then it was truly over. It would be the final silence from her brother. The next morning, she knew she could not wait any longer. The fear of waiting was becoming worse than the fear of acting. She walked to the garden in the cool, gray light of dawn. The city was still asleep. She held the small brown packet of seeds in her pocket. She could feel the tiny, hard shapes through the thin fabric of her pants. It felt like she was carrying 6 tiny stones. When she arrived at the garden, she went to her plot. The small greenhouse looked sturdy and real in the morning light. The clear plastic walls were beaded with moisture on the inside, a good sign. It was holding in the humidity. She opened the small, simple door she had built. The air that came out was warm and damp and smelled intensely of rich, clean earth. It was like the breath of a living thing. She knelt down inside the small structure. It was just big enough for her to kneel in the middle of the dark, prepared soil. She took the seed packet out of her pocket. Her hands were trembling. This felt more important than any other moment in her life. It was a ceremony, a quiet, private ritual between her brother, and the earth. She carefully unfolded the brown paper. The 6 small black seeds lay in the crease. They looked so small, so powerless. They held all of her hope. She poured them into the palm of her left hand. She looked at them. These tiny specks of a distant mountain. These last words from her brother. She decided to plant them in a circle. It felt right. A circle was a shape with no end. With the index finger of her right hand, she made a small hole in the soil. It was only about ½ an inch deep. The soil was soft and yielding. It felt wonderful against her skin. She picked up one of the seeds from her palm. She held it between her thumb and forefinger. She thought about Leo. She tried to picture him smiling, his bright, easy smile. She whispered his name, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the damp air of the greenhouse. She placed the seed in the small hole. Then, gently, she pushed the soil back over it, covering it in darkness. One was planted. She repeated the process. She made another small hole a few inches away. She picked up another seed. This time, she thought about the day at the lake, the one from the photograph, the warmth of the sun, the taste of the ice cream. She placed the second seed in the earth. She continued this way, a slow, deliberate circle of memory and hope. For the third seed, she thought of his letters, the way his words could make her see a world she had never known. For the fourth, she remembered his voice on the phone, a low, comforting rumble. For the fifth, she thought of him as a little boy, her protector, chasing away the monsters under her bed. When she came to the last seed, the sixth seed, she paused. She held it in her hand for a long time. She did not think of a memory. She thought of the future, a future he would not see, a future she had to live without him. A tear escaped from her eye and rolled down her cheek. It fell from her chin and landed on the back of her hand next to the final seed. It was a small, salty drop of grief. She placed the last seed in the final hole, and with it, she buried her tear. She covered it with soil. The circle was complete. The seeds were home. She took a small watering can that she had bought, one with a gentle spout, and she filled it with water from the garden tap. She watered the circle of buried seeds with extreme care, giving them just enough so that the soil was dark and moist, but not flooded. She watched the water sink into the earth, a life-giving drink for the sleeping life within. Then she backed out of the greenhouse and closed the small door. She latched it with the simple wooden peg she had designed. There was nothing more to do. She had done it all. The rest was up to the seeds. The rest was up to the earth. The waiting began. It was a different kind of waiting than before. Before, she had waited with a clumsy, ignorant hope. Now, she waited with the sharp, painful knowledge that she had done everything perfectly. There were no more excuses. This would be the final answer. Her days found a new, rigid routine. Every morning, she would walk to the garden at dawn. She would open the greenhouse door and kneel inside. She would look at the surface of the soil. She was searching for a sign, a crack in the earth, a tiny speck of green, anything. Then she would check the soil with her finger. She would feel its temperature. She would feel its moisture. If it was too dry, she would give it a small, gentle amount of water. If it was too damp, she would leave the door open for a few minutes to let some of the moisture escape. She was like a nurse, tending to a patient in a deep, deep sleep. After her morning check, she would go home. But she could not rest. Her mind was always at the garden. She would come back every evening as the sun was setting, and she would repeat the entire ritual. She would check the soil. She would check the moisture. She would look for a sign. And every day, there was nothing. The days turned into a week. The surface of the soil remained a flat, dark, unbroken circle. The initial fragile hope she had felt began to be replaced by a familiar, heavy dread. The fear of failure was a constant, cold presence at the back of her mind. She started to have trouble sleeping again. She would lie in bed and see the image of the bare soil in her mind's eye. She would get up in the middle of the night and walk to her window, looking out in the direction of the garden, as if she could see the answer from her apartment. The garden around her plot was bursting with life. Mr. Henderson's tomato plants were growing taller every day, and small, pale green tomatoes were beginning to form. The woman with the flowered hat had a plot full of marigolds that were a riot of orange and yellow. A man across the path from her was harvesting huge green heads of lettuce. Life was happening all around her. Her small greenhouse was a house of stillness, a house of silence. Her plot was a patch of emptiness in a sea of growth. It was a constant, painful reminder of her own empty, stalled life. Mr. Henderson would watch her sometimes. She would be kneeling in her greenhouse, staring at the dirt, and she would feel his eyes on her. He never said anything. He never asked if anything had grown. He knew better. He knew that waiting was the hardest part of gardening. He knew it was a private, lonely battle. His silent presence was a strange comfort. It told her that he understood. He had waited for his own seeds to grow. He had faced his own silent, unforgiving earth. She was not alone in her vigil. A second week began. The dread grew heavier. The hope grew thinner. She began to feel a deep, weary sense of resignation. She had been foolish to think this would work. She had been foolish to build the greenhouse, to buy the soil, to spend her last savings on this impossible dream. Leo was gone. He was not sending her a message. They were just seeds. Tiny, dead things from a world away. She was just a lonely, grieving girl playing a make-believe game in a garden. The thought was so painful that it almost made her stop. A few times, she almost did not go to the garden in the morning. She would lie in bed and think, "What is the point? The answer will be the same as yesterday." But she always went. The routine was all she had. Her duty to her brother's last gift was the only thing that got her out of bed. Even if it was a failure, she had to see it through to the end. It was on the 15th day that it happened. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that. It was a cool morning with a thin white mist hanging in the air. She had slept badly. She felt tired and hopeless. The walk to the garden was a slow, heavy march. She did not want to go. She did not want to face another day of silent, empty soil. She reached her plot. She unlatched the small wooden peg on the greenhouse door. She swung the door open. She knelt down, her knees protesting, her eyes already prepared for the familiar sight of nothing. She looked at the soil, and she saw it. At first, her mind did not understand. It was so small, so insignificant, that it barely registered. It was a tiny speck of green, not even green. It was a pale, whitish green, the color of a new leaf that has never seen the sun. It was right in the middle of the circle she had planted. It was a tiny loop of life, a stem that had pushed its way up through the dark earth and was now bent over as if it were still trying to decide whether to stand up straight. It was no bigger than her smallest fingernail. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stared at it, frozen. She could not breathe. She thought she was imagining it. She thought her desperate, hopeful mind had finally created a ghost. She blinked her eyes hard, once, twice. It was still there. It was real. It was alive. A sound escaped her lips. It was a small, quiet sound, a mix between a gasp and a sob. She reached out a trembling finger, wanting to touch it, to make sure it was real. But she stopped herself. It looked so fragile, so delicate. She was afraid her touch might break it. She just knelt there for a long, long time, staring at the tiny green shoot. And then the tears came. They were not the hot, angry tears of grief. They were not the desperate, lonely tears of her darkest nights. They were tears of pure, overwhelming relief. They rolled down her cheeks and dripped from her chin onto the dark, rich soil she had made. She did not make a sound. She just cried in silence, a quiet, personal storm of emotion inside her small plastic house. It had worked, all of it. The weeds, the digging, the mixing, the building. It had all been for this tiny, fragile piece of life. It was a sign. It was an answer. It was a whisper back from the silence. Her brother's last message had been received, and it was growing. After the tears stopped, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The heavy weight she had been carrying for so long felt a little bit lighter. The knot of anxiety in her stomach was gone. She felt empty, but it was a good kind of emptiness. It was the calm after a long, terrible storm. She stayed there for over an hour, just watching the small green shoot, as if it might disappear if she looked away. The sun rose higher, and the mist burned off. The garden began to come to life around her. Other gardeners arrived, with their tools and their quiet purpose. She heard their gentle movements, the snipping of shears, the soft spray of water. Mr. Henderson arrived. He walked past her plot, and he glanced at her as she knelt in her greenhouse. He saw her face. He saw the tears on her cheeks, and he saw the new light in her eyes. He looked down through the clear plastic wall, and he saw the tiny green shoot. He did not say a word. He just gave her one of his small, almost imperceptible nods, and he continued on to his tomato plants. But in that small gesture, a whole conversation passed between them. He understood. He had seen the miracle of the first green sign many times before. He knew the power it held. A new purpose ignited in Willow. It was fierce and protective. Before, her purpose had been to make the seeds grow. Now, her purpose was to keep this one precious plant alive. Her life, which had been a fog of grief and a cycle of desperate waiting, now had a single sharp point of focus. This plant. Her routine changed. It was no longer a routine of hope and fear. It was a routine of careful, dedicated nurturing. She checked the greenhouse 3 times a day now, morning, noon, and evening. She became an expert on the conditions inside the small plastic world. She learned to read the sun, moving a small piece of cheesecloth over the roof during the hottest part of the day to make sure the tender shoot did not get burned. She learned to read the soil, giving it water not on a schedule, but only when it was truly thirsty. She would give it just a few drops at a time, right at its base, using an eyedropper she had bought from the pharmacy. It was a slow, meticulous process. She became a guardian, a protector of this fragile new life, and the plant grew. It grew with a strange, determined speed. Within a few days, the small, bent-over loop had straightened itself into a single, strong stem. It was not a normal green color. It was a pale, silvery green, a color she had never seen on a plant before. Two small leaves unfurled from the top of the stem. They were not shaped like normal leaves. They were long and slender, with slightly pointed tips. And they had a strange, metallic sheen to them, as if they were dusted with a fine, silver powder. When the sun hit them, they did not just reflect the light. They seemed to absorb it, to shimmer with a soft, internal glow. It was an unusual plant. It looked otherworldly. It did not look like it belonged in a community garden in the middle of a big city. It looked like it belonged on the moon, or in a storybook. Willow was fascinated by it. She would spend hours just watching it, observing every tiny change. She noticed that during the brightest part of the day, the leaves would curl in on themselves slightly, as if they were shy of the harsh, direct sun. But in the soft light of the morning and evening, they would open up completely, their silvery surfaces seeming to drink in the gentle light. It confirmed what Leo had written. It liked the dark. Or at least, it did not like the bright, loud light of the day. A few days later, a second shoot pushed its way through the soil, and then a third. Soon, all 6 of the seeds had sprouted. They grew in their perfect circle, 6 small, silvery green soldiers standing at attention. They all grew in the same strange, beautiful way. Their stems were strong, their leaves were long and shimmering. Her small plot, which had been a square of empty, dark earth for so long, was now home to a small, thriving family of the most unusual plants she had ever seen. She felt a deep, fierce love for them. They were not just plants. They were a living, growing memorial to her brother. They were a piece of his world, thriving in hers. They were proof that even after the most terrible, destructive fire, new life can find a way to push through the ashes. Willow's life now revolved around this small, 6-inch-high circle of silver-green leaves. She would go to the garden and spend hours just being with them. The noise of the city seemed to fade away when she was inside her small greenhouse. The pain of her loss did not disappear. It was still there, a quiet ache deep inside her. But it was no longer the only thing she felt. Now, there was also wonder. There was also purpose. There was also a quiet, growing sense of pride. She had brought something beautiful and strange into the world, and she could not wait to see what it would do next. Chapter 6. A Secret in the Dark. The 6 small plants grew. They grew with a quiet, steady determination that was a constant source of wonder for Willow. The small greenhouse she had built became a tiny world of its own, a pocket of warmth and humidity that the plants seemed to love. Her life, which had been a formless gray fog for so long, now had a clear and simple structure. Her days were built around the needs of these 6 fragile, silvery lives. The morning vigil, the midday check, the evening visit. This was the rhythm she lived by. It was a rhythm that left little room for the crushing weight of her own thoughts. The plants were a constant, living present, and they demanded all of her attention. They grew quickly. Their stems, which had been so thin and delicate at first, thickened and became strong. More leaves unfurled, each one as strange and beautiful as the first. They were a soft, shimmering silver green, a color that seemed to change with the light. In the direct sun of midday, they looked almost white, a pale, metallic color that seemed to deflect the harsh light. But in the gentle, angled light of dawn and dusk, they shimmered with a deeper, greener hue, as if they were absorbing the softest parts of the day. She loved to touch them. The surface of the leaves was not like any plant she had ever touched in the flower market. It was not waxy or glossy. It was smooth, but with a texture that felt almost like velvet or the fine dust on a moth's wing. It was cool to the touch, even on the warmest days. Her connection to them was deep and fiercely protective. They were not just plants to her. They were a living extension of her brother's memory. They were a secret she shared with him. She never spoke of them to anyone, not even to the other gardeners. Her project was a source of quiet curiosity in the garden. The other gardeners would sometimes walk by her plot and peer through the clear plastic walls of her strange, clumsy greenhouse. They could see the silvery plants inside, so different from the familiar green of their own vegetables and flowers. They would look, and they would whisper to each other, but no one ever asked her about them. There was a quiet, unspoken respect in the garden for a person's private work. They could see the dedication on her face, the intense focus in her eyes. They understood that this was something important, something more than just gardening. Mr. Henderson, more than anyone, seemed to understand. He never approached her plot directly, but she would often see him from a distance, leaning on his shovel, his pale blue eyes watching her as she tended to her strange silver plants. He watched her measure the water. He watched her adjust the cheesecloth shade. He watched her gently wipe the dust from the large, smooth leaves. She felt that he was not just watching her. He was guarding her. His silent, stern presence was a kind of protection, a sign to the others that this small, sad girl and her strange silver plants were to be left alone. She was grateful for his silent understanding. It allowed her to exist in her own small world, to focus completely on the task at hand. And for a while, that was enough. The steady growth of the plants was a constant reward. Every new leaf was a small victory. Every inch of height the stems gained was a sign that she was doing something right. The plot that had been a square of empty dirt was now filled with a small, shimmering forest of silver green. It was beautiful. But as the weeks passed, a new anxiety began to grow in her, a small, cold seed of doubt planted in the back of her mind. The plants were strong. They were healthy. They were covered in beautiful, shimmering leaves. But there were no flowers. There were not even any buds. She examined the plants every day, her eyes searching for the tiny telltale sign of a new kind of growth. She would look at the point where the leaves met the stem, the place where a flower bud was most likely to form. But there was nothing. There were only more leaves. Her knowledge from the flower market was extensive. She knew the life cycle of 100 different kinds of flowers. She knew that after a period of strong leaf growth, the plant would turn its energy to producing blooms. But her plants did not seem to be following this rule. They just kept making more and more beautiful, shimmering, useless leaves. At first, she told herself to be patient. These were special plants. They were from a different world, a different climate. They would have their own schedule. They would flower when they were ready. But another week passed, and then another. The garden around her exploded into a symphony of color. The marigolds in the plot of the woman with the flowered hat were a brilliant, fiery orange. The man across the path had rose bushes that were covered in deep, fragrant red blooms. Even Mr. Henderson's tomato plants had small, cheerful yellow flowers scattered among their green leaves. Everywhere she looked, there was the proof of life completing its cycle. There were flowers, there were fruits, there was the promise of seeds for the next year. Her plot was an island of sterile beauty. It was lush and green in its own silvery way, but it was incomplete. The doubt began to grow louder. It was a nasty, whispering voice in her head. What if they never flowered? What if they were just leafy plants? What if she had done all this work, built this whole perfect world for a plant that could not produce the one thing it was supposed to produce? A sterile plant. The word echoed in her mind. It sounded so final, so hopeless. Her worry began to eat away at the peace she had found. She started to have trouble sleeping again. She would lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling, her mind filled with images of her beautiful flowerless plants. The old feelings of failure began to creep back in. The feeling that she had let her brother down. He had not sent her seeds for a leafy bush. He had sent her night flowers. The name itself was a promise that was not being kept. The joy she had felt in tending to the plants began to be replaced by a grim, anxious sense of duty. Her morning and evening visits to the garden were no longer moments of quiet wonder. They were tense inspections. She would scan each plant with a desperate, hungry gaze, searching for a bud that was not there. And every day, the absence of flowers was a small, sharp disappointment. The beautiful silver leaves, which had once been a source of so much joy, now seemed to mock her. They were a beautiful, shimmering failure. She started spending hours at the library again. She did not look for the name night flower anymore. She looked for reasons why a plant might not bloom. She read thick, heavy botany books. She learned about soil chemistry, about the importance of phosphorus and potassium for flower production. She learned about photoperiodism, the way some plants need a certain number of hours of darkness before they will flower. She learned about sterile hybrids, plants that had been bred for their leaves and had lost the ability to reproduce. The more she read, the more she worried. She had created the soil herself. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe there was not enough of the right kind of nutrient. The city was full of light pollution. Maybe the plants were not getting enough true, deep darkness to trigger their blooming cycle. Or maybe, and this was the fear that was coldest and sharpest, maybe they were just sterile. Maybe the seeds he had sent her were from a plant that could never make a flower. The thought was unbearable. The flowers were the whole point. They were the part of the story she had not yet seen. They were the final message. Without them, the story was incomplete. The connection was broken. One afternoon, she was in the garden, staring at her plants with a familiar, worried frown. Mr. Henderson was working on his own plot, methodically tying his heavy tomato vines to their stakes. He had not spoken to her in weeks, but she had always felt his quiet, watchful presence. She did not know what made her do it. Maybe it was the weight of her worry, which had become too heavy to carry alone. She walked over to his plot. He did not look up as she approached. He kept his attention on his work. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice small. He finished tying a knot with a slow, deliberate movement. Then he turned to her. His pale blue eyes were as sharp as ever. "They're healthy," he said, before she could even ask her question. He had known what she was there for. He had seen the worry on her face for weeks. "The leaves are strong. The roots are good. I can tell from here." "But there are no flowers," Willow said, the words coming out in a rush of frustration. "It has been months. Everything else in the garden is flowering." Mr. Henderson looked at her plants. He looked at the shimmering silver leaves, so strange and out of place among the familiar greens of the garden. Then he looked back at her. "Some things take their time," he said, his voice quiet. "You can't force a thing to be what it isn't. You can't make it follow your schedule. You have made a good home for it. You have done your part. Now you wait. That is all. Waiting is part of the work." He turned back to his tomatoes, a clear sign that the conversation was over. Willow stood there for a moment. His words were not a solution. They were not an answer, but they were strangely comforting. He had not told her that she was a failure. He had not told her that the plants were sterile. He had just told her to wait. He had told her that the waiting itself was part of the process. She walked back to her plot. She looked at her beautiful, flowerless plants. She took a deep breath. She would wait. She would do her part. She would keep her faith. But waiting was hard. The summer grew hotter. The days grew long and humid. The nights were warm and sticky and offered little relief. Willow's small apartment was an oven. She would lie in bed with a fan blowing warm air across her face, unable to find comfort, unable to find sleep. Her grief, which had been pushed into the background by the hard work and the initial excitement of her project, came back to visit her in the long, dark, silent hours of the night. In the heat and the stillness, the memories of her brother felt sharp and close. She would think about their last phone call. She would try to remember the exact sound of his laugh. She would ache with a sense of loss so profound that it was a physical pain in her chest. It was on one of these nights that the discovery happened. The day had been brutally hot. The sun had beaten down on the city, and the air was thick and heavy. The night was no better. It was almost midnight, and the air in her apartment was still and suffocating. She could not sleep. Her mind was racing. She was thinking about her plants. She was thinking about her brother. The four walls of her apartment felt like they were closing in on her. She felt a desperate, urgent need to move, to breathe air that was not the same stale air she had been breathing all day. She got out of bed. She pulled on a pair of old shorts and a t-shirt. She did not know where she was going. She just knew she had to go out. She walked down the stairs and out into the empty street. The city at night was a different world. It was quiet, but it was not silent. There was the constant low hum of the city breathing. The street lights cast a strange orange glow on everything, making the familiar buildings look like they were part of a dream. She began to walk. She had no destination. She just let her feet carry her. She walked past closed shops and dark apartment windows. A lone taxi drove past, its tires hissing on the warm pavement. She felt like a ghost, the only person awake in a sleeping world. The feeling was not scary. It was peaceful. She felt anonymous, invisible, and then she realized where her feet were taking her. She was walking towards the garden. The idea of the garden at night was a strange one. She had only ever seen it in the daylight, full of people and purposeful work. What would it be like now in the dark, when it was sleeping? She arrived at the chain-link fence. The gate was locked with a simple padlock, but she knew that there was a loose section of fence at the back that the gardeners used as a shortcut. She found it and slipped through. The garden was a world of shadows. The moonlight was filtered through the leaves of the tall trees that grew around the edges, casting shifting, dappled patterns on the ground. It was not scary. It was magical. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy perfume of night-blooming jasmine from someone's plot. She could hear the chirping of crickets, a sound she never heard during the day. She walked slowly down the familiar paths. The plants in the other plots were dark, sleeping shapes. A row of sunflowers, their heavy heads bowed down as if in prayer. The tangled mass of a pumpkin vine, its large leaves like dark hands spread out on the ground. It was all so familiar, but so different. She felt like an explorer in a new and secret land. She walked towards her own plot in the far corner of the garden. As she got closer, she saw something strange, a light. It was a very faint light, a soft, gentle glow coming from inside her greenhouse. Her first thought was that someone was in there, a thief. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who would be in her greenhouse in the middle of the night? Then she told herself that was foolish. What was there to steal? Some strange, leafy plants. Maybe it was a reflection, the moonlight hitting the plastic in a strange way. She approached cautiously, her footsteps making no sound on the soft earth path. She crept up to the side of the greenhouse and peered through the clear plastic wall. What she saw made her stop breathing. The light was not a reflection. It was not a flashlight. The light was coming from the plants themselves. It was a soft, gentle, silver light, and it was radiating from the leaves. Every single leaf on every single one of her 6 plants was glowing. It was not a bright light. It was a subtle, ethereal glow, like the light of a full moon on a field of snow. It was a living light. It seemed to pulse with a slow, gentle rhythm, like a sleeping heartbeat. The inside of her small greenhouse was filled with this soft, magical light. It did not cast sharp shadows. It just filled the space with a calm, silver radiance. She stood there, frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was impossible. It was magic. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her entire life. After a long moment, she slowly, carefully reached for the wooden peg on the door. She unlatched it and swung the door open. The warm, damp air from inside washed over her, and with it came the silver light, spilling out into the dark garden. She knelt down inside the greenhouse. She was surrounded by the light. It bathed her face and her hands in its soft, cool glow. She reached out a trembling hand and touched one of the leaves. It was cool and smooth, just as it always was. But she could feel a faint, gentle vibration under her fingertips, a low, quiet hum of energy. The light was coming from within the leaf itself, a network of tiny glowing veins that spread out like a silver river system. She was in awe. She was in a state of pure, unthinking wonder. She had been so focused on the flowers, so desperate for a sign of a bloom, that she had missed the miracle that was happening right in front of her. The leaves. The leaves were the magic. And then she understood. The words from her brother's note came back to her, and this time they clicked into place with a sudden, brilliant clarity. The locals call them night flowers. He had not written that they had night flowers. He had written that the plants themselves were the night flowers, and his joke said they like the dark, just like you. It was not a joke. It was a clue. It was the most important instruction of all. The magic did not happen in the sun. The magic happened in the dark. A wave of emotion so powerful, it almost knocked her over, washed through her. It was a mix of everything: grief for her brother, and an overwhelming love for him. Gratitude for this impossible, magical gift he had sent her, and a deep, profound sense of connection. He was not gone, not completely. He was here, in this secret, glowing light. This was a secret that belonged only to them. It was a shared magic that death could not touch. She sat there, inside the glowing greenhouse, for hours. She did not move. She just watched the light. She watched the way it pulsed with its slow, gentle rhythm. She watched the way it made the small space feel like a holy temple. She felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more complete than any peace she had ever known. The heavy weight of her grief was still there, but it had changed. The light did not erase the darkness, but it made the darkness beautiful. She understood now that beauty was not just found in the bright, cheerful colors of the day. There was a different kind of beauty that could only be found in the deepest, quietest dark. A soft, gentle, silver beauty. The beauty of a secret. The beauty of a memory. The beauty of a love that was strong enough to shine even after the sun had gone down. She stayed until the first hint of gray appeared in the eastern sky. As the world began to grow lighter, the silver glow of the leaves began to fade. By the time the sun was fully up, they were back to their normal, shimmering silver green. The magic had retreated, waiting for the dark to return. Willow backed out of the greenhouse and closed the door. She walked home through the waking city, but she was not the same person who had left her apartment a few hours before. She was a person who was carrying a secret, a beautiful, glowing, silver secret. And she knew that she would never feel truly alone in the dark again. Chapter 7. A Garden to Share. The discovery of the glowing leaves changed everything for Willow. The anxious, worried part of her mind, the part that had been so fixated on the absence of flowers, went quiet. It was replaced by a deep, calm sense of wonder. Her relationship with the plants transformed. They were no longer a project, a task, or a test she had to pass. They were a living miracle, a nightly conversation with her brother's memory. Her life now had two distinct rhythms. There was the daytime rhythm, the familiar routine of checking the soil, watering, and tending to the physical needs of the plants. This was the work of her hands. Then there was the nighttime rhythm, the secret, sacred time when she would visit the garden and sit with the light. This was the work of her heart. Every night, long after the city had fallen asleep, she would slip out of her apartment and walk the quiet streets to the garden. She would enter through the loose part of the fence, a silent ghost in a sleeping world. The nightly visit became her church, her sanctuary. Kneeling inside the small greenhouse, bathed in the soft silver light of the leaves, she felt a sense of peace that was so profound it felt like a kind of prayer. The light was her companion. It did not speak, but it listened. She would talk to the plants, and in doing so, she would talk to Leo. She would tell him about her day. She would tell him how much she missed him. She would thank him for this incredible gift. And in the steady, gentle pulse of the light, she felt an answer. She felt his presence. The grief had not vanished, but it had a new shape. It was no longer a crushing, suffocating weight. It was a quiet, constant ache. But it was an ache intertwined with a strange and magical beauty. The light did not take away the sadness, but it gave the sadness a place to rest. As the weeks passed, a new thought began to form in her mind, a thought that grew slowly, night after night, in the quiet glow of the greenhouse. This light, this incredible healing light, was her secret. It was her private comfort. But was it meant to be hers alone? She thought of the city around her, a city full of millions of people. She thought of the dark apartment windows she passed on her nightly walks. Behind those windows were other people, living with their own private sorrows, their own silent heartaches. She thought of the faces she saw on the street during the day, the tired faces on the morning bus, the stressed, hurried faces of people rushing to work, the lonely faces of the elderly sitting by themselves on park benches. The world was full of a quiet, hidden pain. She had been so lost in her own grief that she had not been able to see it before. But now, she did. Her own journey through the darkness had made her eyes sensitive to the shadows in others. She had this light, this beautiful, gentle, silver light that had the power to make the darkness feel less lonely. Was it fair to keep it all to herself? The question grew louder in her mind. It felt like a betrayal of the gift itself. A light is not meant to be hidden. It is meant to be shared. The idea was terrifying. It would mean opening up her private sanctuary. It would mean sharing her secret with the world. It would mean talking to people, explaining, organizing, stepping out of the quiet, protected world she had built for herself. It felt impossible. She was not a leader. She was a quiet background person. But the idea would not go away. It felt important. It felt like the next step. It felt like the true purpose of the gift her brother had sent her. He had been a soldier. He had spent his life in service to others. Maybe this was her way of serving, not with a gun, but with a garden. The final push came from an unexpected place. One afternoon, she was at the garden, tending to her plants. Mr. Henderson was working on his own plot as usual. He had harvested most of his tomatoes, and now he was carefully collecting the seeds from the largest, healthiest ones, laying them out on a piece of newspaper to dry in the sun. He was preparing for next year. He was ensuring that the life of his garden would continue. He called out to her. His voice was rough, as always, but there was a new quality to it. It was less of a command and more of an invitation. "Come here," he said. She walked over to his plot. He picked up one of his prized tomatoes. It was a deep, vibrant red, and it was heavy in his hand. It was a perfect specimen, the result of a whole season of patient, dedicated work. "A thing like this," he said, holding it out to her. "It is no good if you just grow it and let it sit on a shelf to be admired. The point of it is to be eaten, to be shared. That is how its goodness spreads. That is how it feeds people." He pressed the tomato into her hand. It was still warm from the sun. That is how it becomes more than just a plant. It becomes a meal. It becomes a memory. It becomes a part of something bigger. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes seeing more than just the girl in front of him. He looked over at her greenhouse, at the shimmering silver leaves that were visible through the plastic. "Some things," he said quietly, "are meant to be shared." And then he turned back to his seeds. His words were like a key, unlocking the final door in her mind. He was right. Her plants were not just a private memorial. They were not just an object of beauty to be admired. They had a purpose, and their purpose was to be shared. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now there was something stronger, a sense of conviction, a sense of mission. She had to do it. For Leo, for Mr. Henderson, for all the other lonely people living in their own dark rooms. That night, she did not just go to the garden to sit with the light. She went with a notebook and a pen. She knelt inside the glowing greenhouse, and in the soft silver light of the leaves, she began to make a plan. The idea that formed was simple, but it was also huge and ambitious. A garden, a public garden, not a community garden where everyone had their own plot, but a shared space, a place where anyone could come at any time, but especially at night, a place to sit in the quiet, a place to be with the light, a memorial garden, a garden for people who were grieving, for people who were lost, for people who were just tired of the noise and the brightness of the world. A garden where the darkness was not something to be afraid of. A garden where the darkness was beautiful. The first step was to find a place. A community garden plot was too small, too private. This needed to be a public space. She started walking the streets of her neighborhood with a new purpose. She was no longer just walking to get from one place to another. She was searching. She was looking at the empty spaces, the forgotten corners of the city. She saw them everywhere now that she was looking. A vacant lot, filled with trash and overgrown with weeds. A small, triangular patch of grass by a busy intersection that no one ever used. And then she found it. It was a small, neglected parquet, only a few blocks from her apartment. She had probably walked past it 100 times without ever really seeing it. It was a sad, forgotten place. It was a small square of land surrounded by a low, rusty iron fence. There was a cracked concrete path that ran through the middle and 2 old wooden benches with peeling paint. A single large oak tree stood in one corner, its branches bare even though it was summer. The rest of the park was just patches of dry brown grass and hard, packed earth. A broken bottle lay in one corner. It was a place that the city had given up on. It was a place that no one cared about. It was perfect. It was a piece of forgotten darkness, just waiting for someone to bring it to light. The next step was much harder. She had to get permission. She had to enter the world of city government, a world of forms and offices and people in suits. The thought was terrifying. She went to the city hall, a huge, imposing building that made her feel small and insignificant. She wandered through the long, confusing hallways until she found the Parks and Recreation Department. She took a number and sat in a hard plastic chair, waiting for her turn. She felt completely out of place. Everyone else seemed to know what they were doing. They had briefcases and important-looking papers. She just had her notebook with her clumsy drawings and her wild, impossible idea. When her number was called, she went to a counter and spoke to a woman with a tired, bored face. Willow tried to explain her idea. Her voice was quiet and shaky. She talked about a memorial garden, a night garden, a place for peace and quiet. The woman looked at her with a blank expression. She did not understand. She pushed a form towards Willow. It was a long, complicated form with dozens of questions in small, hard-to-read print. The woman told her to fill it out and mail it in. It was a clear dismissal. Willow left the city hall feeling defeated and foolish. Her grand idea had crashed against the hard, indifferent wall of bureaucracy, but she did not give up. She thought of Mr. Henderson's words. She thought of the pulsing silver light. She went home and she looked at the form. She spent 2 days carefully filling it out. She answered every question as best she could. She drew a detailed map of her proposed garden. She wrote a long, heartfelt letter explaining what the garden would be for. She described the unique, glowing plants, though she was careful not to make it sound too much like magic. She called them a rare bioluminescent species. She mailed the form and the letter, and then she waited. Weeks passed. She heard nothing. She called the Parks Department. She was put on hold for a long time. She was transferred from one person to another. No one seemed to know anything about her application. It had probably been lost in a pile of papers on someone's desk. The old feelings of hopelessness began to creep back in. The world was too big, too busy, too complicated. She was too small. Her idea was too strange. It was Mr. Henderson who helped her, without even knowing it. One afternoon, she was at the garden feeling particularly discouraged. She told him about her struggles with the city. She told him about the form and the silence. He listened, his face as stern as ever. When she was finished, he just grunted. "You went to the wrong people," he said. "The people in those offices, they don't know anything about gardens. They know about paper. You need to talk to the people who know about the city, the real city." He told her about city council meetings. He told her that her neighborhood had a city councilor, a person who was elected to represent the people who lived there. This was the person she needed to talk to. This was a new idea, a scary idea. It would mean speaking in public, but it was a clear, concrete step. It was a path forward. Willow found out who her city councilor was. Her name was Ms. Alvarez. There was a community meeting the following week. It was a chance for residents to speak directly to her. Willow knew she had to go. She spent the next week preparing. She wrote down what she wanted to say. She practiced saying it out loud in her apartment, her voice trembling. She made copies of her garden plan. The night of the meeting, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. The meeting was in a school gymnasium. It was filled with people from her neighborhood. They were there to talk about traffic and garbage collection and a new building that was being proposed. They were all real-world problems. Her idea for a magical night garden felt silly and small in comparison. She sat in the back, listening to the other speakers. They were passionate and angry and loud. When it was her turn to speak, her legs felt like jelly. She walked to the microphone at the front of the room. She looked out at all the faces staring at her. She looked at Ms. Alvarez, who was sitting at a long table, looking tired. Willow opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her mind went completely blank. All the words she had practiced were gone. She just stood there in a terrible, humiliating silence. And then she looked up, and she saw him. Mr. Henderson. He was standing in the back of the gymnasium. She had no idea he was coming. He was just there, in his old work clothes, his face stern and serious. He caught her eye, and he gave her one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. It was all she needed. It was a silent message that said, "I am here. You can do this." She took a deep breath, and she began to speak. She did not use the words she had practiced. She just spoke from her heart. She did not talk about bureaucracy or applications. She talked about the city. She talked about the noise and the hurry and the loneliness. She talked about her brother. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. She told them about his death. She told them about the seeds he had sent her. She told them about her own journey through grief, about the crushing darkness and the suffocating silence. The room, which had been buzzing with impatient energy, grew quiet. People were listening, and then she told them about the light. She described the soft silver glow. She described the peace she found there. She told them her idea, a garden for the dark times, a place of light for the people who were lost in the shadows, a living memorial, not just for her brother, but for all the people the city had lost. She talked about the forgotten parquet, that sad, neglected piece of land. She said, "Let's take this piece of darkness and let's make it beautiful. Let's make it shine." When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence in the gymnasium. And then someone started to clap. It was a slow, quiet clap at first, and then someone else joined in, and then another. Soon, the whole room was filled with the sound of applause. Willow looked at Ms. Alvarez. The city councilor was no longer looking tired. She was looking at Willow with a new expression in her eyes. It was an expression of respect and of understanding. That night changed everything. Ms. Alvarez became her champion. She guided her through the maze of city bureaucracy. She found the lost application. She pushed it through the right channels. But something else happened too. The community had heard her story, and they wanted to help. The next Saturday, when Willow went to the forgotten parquet, she was not alone. A handful of people from the neighborhood were there. They had brought shovels and rakes and garbage bags. The big, strong man from the community garden who had helped her with her greenhouse was there. The old woman with the flowered hat was there. David, the young man from the hardware store, was there. And of course, Mr. Henderson was there, a stern, silent general, ready to command his small army. They started to work. They pulled the weeds. They picked up the broken glass and the trash. They dug up the hard, packed earth. It was the same work Willow had done on her own small plot, but this time she was not alone. The work was shared. The burden was lighter. More people came. Every weekend, the small group of volunteers grew. Local businesses donated supplies. A hardware store donated wood for new benches. A nursery donated bags of compost and mulch. The community was taking ownership of the project. It was no longer just Willow's garden. It was their garden. Willow had to learn how to take cuttings from her precious plants. The thought was terrifying. It felt like she was hurting them. Mr. Henderson showed her how. He showed her the precise way to snip a stem just below a leaf node. He showed her how to dip the cut end in rooting hormone and how to plant it in a small pot of its own. He was a patient, gentle teacher. Soon, Willow had dozens of small pots, each with a single silver-green leaf sitting inside her greenhouse. She was creating a new generation. She was spreading the light. The parquet was transformed. The hard, dead earth became a series of gently curving beds filled with rich, dark soil. New paths were laid down, made of soft wood chips that were quiet underfoot. The old benches were sanded and painted a dark, calming blue. The community worked together, a quiet, purposeful team. Willow, the girl who had hidden from the world, found herself at the center of it all. She was no longer just a quiet observer. She was a leader. She answered questions. She directed volunteers. She found a strength in herself she never knew she had. She was not loud or commanding. She was a quiet leader, just like the quiet garden she was building. Finally, the day came when the new plants were ready. They were small, but their roots were strong. A team of volunteers carefully transplanted them from their small pots into the new garden beds. Dozens of small, silver-green plants arranged in gentle, sweeping curves. The garden was ready. It was named simply Leo's Garden. There was a small, simple wooden sign at the entrance. The community gathered for a quiet opening ceremony at dusk. It was not a big, loud party. It was a quiet gathering of the people who had helped to build it. Willow stood in front of them all. Ms. Alvarez said a few words. Mr. Henderson stood in the back, his arms crossed, a rare, almost smile on his stern face. Willow spoke last. She thanked everyone. Her voice did not tremble. She looked out at the faces of her new friends, her community, and she told them her brother would have loved this. As the last light of the sun faded from the sky, a soft, collective gasp went through the small crowd. One by one, the plants began to glow. A faint, silver light at first, then growing stronger as the darkness deepened. Soon, the entire garden was filled with a soft, magical, silver radiance. The forgotten, neglected parquet was transformed into a place of breathtaking, otherworldly beauty. People walked slowly through the glowing paths. They sat on the new dark blue benches. They did not speak. There was no need for words. They just sat together in the quiet, healing light. Willow watched them. She saw the peace on their faces. She saw the wonder in their eyes. She had done it. She had taken her own deep, private pain, and she had transformed it into a gift for her whole community. Her grief was not gone. It would always be a part of her. But it was no longer just a source of pain. It was now also a source of light. A light that was big enough to share. Chapter 8. Where the Light Blooms. Leo's garden became a quiet phenomenon in the city. There was no grand announcement, no story in the newspapers. Its existence spread through whispers, through quiet word of mouth. A nurse, exhausted after a long and difficult shift, would tell a coworker about a place she had found to sit in the peace and quiet. A student, overwhelmed with the stress of exams, would mention a strange, glowing garden where he could finally clear his head. A man who had recently lost his wife would tell a friend in his grief support group about a place that did not try to offer easy answers. A place that was simply calm and beautiful in the dark. The garden was a secret that people chose to share. And so, they came. Night after night, the garden drew a small, shifting congregation of the city's quiet souls. They were not tourists seeking a spectacle. They were seekers of solace. They would arrive alone or in pairs, their footsteps soft on the wood-chipped paths. They would find an empty bench or simply stand among the glowing plants, and they would breathe. The garden had its own unspoken rules, a code of conduct that no one had to write down. People did not speak loudly. They did not play music. They did not take bright, flashing photographs. There was a shared, intuitive understanding that this was a sacred space, a library for the heart. The silver light of the plants seemed to encourage a gentle, inward focus. It was a light that was not for seeing, but for feeling. Willow was the garden's silent keeper. Her life had found its final, true rhythm. The frantic energy of building and organizing was over, replaced by a steady, peaceful purpose. She no longer had to hide her nightly visits. She was no longer a ghost slipping through a hole in a fence. Now, she would walk to the garden in the early evening, a set of keys in her pocket, and she would unlock the simple iron gate. She would spend her evenings there, not as a manager, but as one of its quiet inhabitants. She would walk the paths, her presence a calm, reassuring constant. She would pull a small weed that others might have missed. She would gently brush a fallen leaf from one of the glowing plants. She was not just tending a garden. She was tending a feeling. She was the guardian of its peace. She watched the people who came. She never spoke to them unless they spoke to her first. She learned their faces, their routines. There was an old man who came every single night, no matter the weather. He would sit on the same bench for exactly 1 hour, his hands resting on a worn wooden cane, his eyes closed. Willow never learned his story, and she never asked. His silent nightly vigil was his own, and she respected that. There was a young couple who would come and sit on a bench, holding hands, not speaking, just watching the light. There was a woman who would walk the circular path over and over again, her steps slow and meditative. These people, these strangers, became a part of her quiet world. They were a community of souls brought together by a shared need for a gentle space in a harsh world. She felt a deep, profound connection to them, a connection that did not require words. In their quiet presence, she felt less alone. Her own grief had a place to rest here, among the quiet grief of others. The pain of her brother's absence was still a part of her, a permanent ache in her heart. But in the garden, that ache was transformed. It was no longer a source of isolation. It was the source of her connection to every person who walked through the gate. Her pain was the seed from which this entire, beautiful, healing place had grown. This understanding changed her relationship with her own sadness. She stopped fighting it. She stopped seeing it as an enemy. She learned to live with it, to carry it. She learned that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a landscape to be inhabited. And in Leo's garden, she had created a beautiful, gentle landscape for it. The seasons turned. The hot, humid summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The big oak tree in the corner of the garden, which had stood bare and skeletal for so long, had grown a new, full canopy of healthy green leaves during the summer. Now, those leaves turned a brilliant, fiery gold. They would fall onto the wood-chip paths, a soft, colorful carpet that crunched underfoot. The glowing plants did not seem to notice the change in seasons. They did not lose their leaves. Their silver light did not dim. They were a constant, steady presence as the world around them changed. Winter came, and with it, the cold. The first snow fell. Willow worried about the plants. They were from a high, mountainous climate, so she knew they could handle the cold. But she had grown them in a protected, humid greenhouse. She was not sure how they would handle the harsh, dry cold of a city winter. The first night it snowed, she went to the garden, her heart full of anxiety. The city was covered in a thick white blanket. The world was hushed and beautiful. The iron fence of the garden was topped with a line of soft white snow. She unlocked the gate and stepped inside, and she saw a sight so beautiful it made her gasp. The garden was transformed into a wonderland of silver and white. Every one of the plants was dusted with a fine layer of fresh snow. The snow did not hide their light. It seemed to amplify it. The silver glow radiated up through the layer of white, so that each plant looked like a soft, glowing lantern. The light reflected off the millions of tiny ice crystals in the snow, creating a soft, shimmering halo around each plant. The entire garden was filled with a gentle, diffused radiance that was even more magical than the light in the summer. It was breathtaking. That night, more people than ever came to the garden. They were drawn by the rumor of this impossible, beautiful sight. They stood in the cold, their breath making white clouds in the air, and they watched the silver light glowing through the snow. There was a sense of shared wonder, a feeling that they were all witnessing a true and profound miracle. In that moment, Willow understood that the plants were stronger than she had ever imagined. They were not fragile, hothouse flowers. They were tough. They were resilient. They had found a way to be beautiful, even in the coldest, darkest time of the year. It was a powerful lesson. It was a message of hope. Her own life had found a new, quiet stability. She never went back to working at the flower market. The thought of it still brought a faint pang of sadness, a memory of a life that was no longer hers. Her days were now spent on the quiet work of maintaining the garden. The city, in recognition of the garden's value to the community, had given her a small, modest salary to be its official caretaker. It was not much money, but it was enough. She lived a simple life. She did not need much. She had a purpose that was more fulfilling than any job she could imagine. Mr. Henderson remained her quiet mentor. He never came to the night garden. He would shake his head and grumble that the night was for sleeping, not for staring at glowing weeds. But Willow knew that he was proud. He would sometimes leave a small bag of his saved tomato seeds for her on the bench, his silent way of contributing to the garden's future. The community that had formed around the building of the garden remained strong. David, from the hardware store, would stop by with a new tool he thought she might need. The woman with the flowered hat would bring her a warm cup of tea on cold evenings. They were her family now, a quiet, supportive family, bound together by the shared experience of creating something beautiful. One morning in the early spring, as the last of the snow was melting and the first brave crocuses were pushing their way through the cold earth in other parts of the city, Willow was in the garden, doing her morning check. She was kneeling by one of the plants, the first one that had sprouted, the one she secretly thought of as the mother plant. She was gently clearing away some of the dead leaves from the oak tree that had fallen around its base. And then she saw it. At the base of the plant, nestled right where the strong, silvery stem met the dark, rich earth, was something new. It was a tiny, tightly closed bud. It was not a leaf bud. It was different. It was rounder, fatter. It was unmistakably a flower bud. Her heart stopped. She stared at it, her mind refusing to believe what her eyes were seeing. A flower, after all this time. After she had completely given up on the idea of flowers. After she had accepted and even come to love the sterile, leafy beauty of the plants. Here was a flower. She touched it with the tip of her finger. It was real. It was firm and alive. She searched the other plants, and she found them. Almost every one of the plants in the garden had one or two of these small, secret buds hidden down low near the earth. They had been forming in secret all through the cold, dark winter. They had been preparing for their own quiet, unhurried spring. A joy so pure and so intense, it felt like a burst of sunlight spread through her chest. It was a feeling she had not felt in years. It was a feeling she thought she might never feel again. It was pure, unadulterated happiness. She laughed. A real out-loud laugh, a sound that felt strange and wonderful in her own ears. It was all so perfect. It was all so beautifully right. The plants had not been sterile. They had just been waiting. They had been waiting for the right time. They had been waiting until she had stopped looking, until she had stopped wanting it so desperately. They had been waiting to give her this final, perfect surprise. Over the next few weeks, she watched the buds with a new, joyful anticipation. They grew slowly, swelling with a secret life. And then, one evening, the first one opened. The flower was not what she had expected. It was not a big, flashy bloom. It was a simple, delicate, bell-shaped flower. It had 5 petals, and they were the same shimmering, silver green as the leaves. But the light was different. The leaves glowed with a steady, peaceful, silver light. The flower glowed with a brighter, warmer light. It was a silver gold, a light that seemed to contain the coolness of the moon and the warmth of a candle flame all at once. And it had a scent. A soft, sweet, clean scent that smelled a little like vanilla, a little like fresh rain, and a little like something she had never smelled before. It was the most beautiful, hopeful thing she had ever seen. Soon, all the plants were dotted with these small, glowing silver gold bells. The garden was even more magical than before. The steady, peaceful light of the leaves was now accented by these small, warm points of brighter light. It was a perfect harmony. On the night that the most flowers were in bloom, Willow returned to a ritual she had long since abandoned. She took one perfect, glowing flower from the garden. She did not leave it on a bus seat or a park bench. She took it home. She placed it in a small glass of water on the table next to her bed. That night, she slept in a room filled with a soft, silver gold light and the sweet, gentle scent of hope. She was a different person from the broken, grieving girl who had first planted these seeds. The grief was still a part of her story. It was the deep, dark soil from which everything else had grown. But it was not the whole story. Her story now was also about resilience. It was about community. It was about the strange, unexpected ways that life finds a way to continue. It was about the profound and sometimes magical discovery that even in the deepest, most profound darkness, something beautiful can still find a way to bloom. Her life had come full circle. She was once again a person who shared flowers with the world. But now, she understood the true meaning of the gift. She was not just sharing a flower. She was sharing a light, a small beacon of hope, a quiet promise of beauty, a gentle reminder for anyone who might find it that even after the longest, coldest, darkest night, the sun will always, eventually, rise again. And sometimes, if you are very, very lucky, you will find a flower that has learned to make its own light.